Hello, everyone. We're going to pick up in Bible in 2 Samuel chapter 22. We're going. Sorry, my eyes are really dry right now. I think I've been staring at the computer screen too long. We are going to. By the way, it's good to make sure when you're staring at the computer screen, you can tend to not blink as much, which will dry out your eyes. So it's good to make sure you blink every once in a while to make sure your eyes are not dry, because we have a tendency to forget to blink. 2 Samuel 22, we're actually going to skip forward a little bit. 2 Samuel 22 is a psalm. Essentially, a lot of people think it's pretty close to Psalm 18. It's nothing wrong with it or anything. We're just going to kind of skip past it because, um, just for the sake of time, we won't be able to get to everything. And I'm not going to go through every line of a psalm. There's plenty of great things in it, but I'm going to skip forward. Chapter 23 as well, we're going to kind of skip most of it. It just kind of, most of it is talking about a lot of, lists out a lot, it's the continuation of the psalm, and it lists out a lot of David's mighty men and a lot of their accomplishments. Some pretty cool accomplishments in 2 Samuel 23 of some of these guys. They had a lot of amazing things that they did. There was a guy who uh, like stood in place where all of other people retreated, and he stood there in the middle of a field and stuff like that. And there was, it talks about like Abishai, the brother of Joab. He killed 300 men at one point. And, it talks about uh, Benaiah, who did many deeds, killed a lion in the midst of a pit on a snowy day, stuff like that. There's some pretty cool stories among them. At the end of the chapter, it was there's one cool one in verse 14. At one point, it says David was fighting battle, and he was like, as you say during battle, at a moment where you're able to talk to somebody, he's weary, he's tired, and he said in verse 15, David said with longing, "Oh, that someone would give me a drink of water from the well of Bethlehem, which is by the gate." He just kind of saying it out loud, like, "Oh man," just like you think, like, if you're, I don't know what you guys could compare it to, but picture if you were really exhausted and sweaty and I don't know, on a beach or something, and you forgot to bring something to drink, and you're thinking about lemonade. Like you say to a buddy, "Oh, imagine if we had some fresh squeezed lemonade right now with ice in it. Oh, and it'd be so good," or something. And buddy's like, "Yeah, that'd be good." And that's just kind of how he meant it. He was like, "Oh man, I'm thinking right now. I'm thinking of the the well of Bethlehem, because remember Bethlehem is where David's from." He's like, "Oh, that well in Bethlehem." I mean, he was like, I used to drink from it all the time as a kid. It had just like sweetest, cleanest water. And he just, because he's exhausted and weary from fighting, he's like, "Oh man, I wish somebody could give me um, a drink from it." And because they're near Bethlehem, he knows it's nearby, and he's probably being like, "Oh, it'd be nice to have a drink from that well. It's pretty close, but oh man." So, but it says that in verse 16, three of his men, in loyalty to David, went on a crazy kamikaze mission, going through and like special forces type mission, going through, breaking through the lines of the Philistines into the Philistines' lines, breaking through there just for the sake of getting him a drink. And it says that he went and they drew water from the well, and they took it and brought it to David. I don't know whether it was in a bucket or even just a ladle, but they went and basically got him a drink of water. It would almost be like taking a cup and fighting through, battling people, and going and getting a cup full, and then fighting back through to bring this cup to their king. And they brought it to David and said, "Here you go, David." And he was like so blown away. It said in verse 17, like he just so blown away by it, by the fact that they would do something like this, that he said he couldn't even drink it. He refused to drink it because like it was such an honorable thing. It was like that they did. And so instead he offered it to God. He poured it out as an offering to God, because again, when you give something over to God, the bigger of a gift it is like how much it means to you. Like for instance, if I only have, you know, you remember the woman with three mites? It was like three pennies essentially. she gave those 3 pennies to Jesus, and other people were giving large thousands and thousands of dollars. And Jesus was blown away by this old widow giving 3 pennies. And everybody's like, who cares about that? And he's like, that's all she had. That's an unbelievable gift to give to God. And so obviously you see him pour it out and you'd be like, oh man, that was a waste. Well, he was basically doing something for God, giving it over to God as an honor and glory to God, and to pray for success for their battle, and giving glory to God, because David that was a huge deal that they went and got that. But anyway, we're going to skip past chapter 23 as well. Just goes through some of the different things of his mighty men, and we're going to talk about chapter 24. This happens later, late in David's life. So David lives his life. He's an older man now. And it says, though, he messes up again. It says, the anger of the Lord was aroused against Israel, and he moved David against them. It says he, but some Chronicles talks about this he being capitalized, H-E, but it doesn't necessarily, they assumed the capital was there, the translators, and so they put H-E because they assumed this was God. But Chronicles writer assumes it was Satan, so Satan moved David to do this. That fits a little better, but regardless, David essentially tells his men that he wants to number the people of Israel. He wants to take a census. What a census is when you number the amount of people that you have in different categories, but specifically here, you number the number of fighting men. Now, we're in the year 2020 right now. We're in the middle of taking a census. It's a lot different nowadays for us, because here in our country, there's nothing wrong with taking a census. They're just trying to find out how many people live in the United States, how many people in each household, and how many people in each age group, how many people live in each city. There's nothing wrong with that. They're just trying to find out information. But in Israel, it was a much different story. You see, in the book of Exodus, I want to say it was the book of Exodus. I'm going to look it up really quick. I think it's Exodus chapter something or other. I'm going to read it to you right now. Just bear with me. Sorry. One more second. I found it. Exodus 30, verse 12. When you take the census of the children of Israel for their number, then every man shall give a ransom for himself to the Lord when you number them, that there be no plague among them when you number them. So what that is saying, you might not understand what it's saying, but it's basically saying that the only time you can take a census is when God commands you to do it. Because when people number things, they can only, and this is specifically in Israel, again, this does not apply to today. You can't really go one for one when applying things that God says to Israel or God commands Israel to us, because we are not Israel. That's why you can't go through the law and you see things where people have to shave the size of their beard, and you say, oh no, it says in the book of Leviticus that I'm not supposed to shave the side of my beard. That's I've done something wrong. That was applied specifically to Israel because of how God wanted them to look to other nations. He wouldn't want them to be like other nations and stuff like that. So stuff like that only applies to Israel. Obviously, that other things can apply to us as well, like the 10 Commandments, because those things like do not murder, that didn't start at the 10 Commandments. That was wrong back when Cain killed Abel, So anyway, little tangent there. When in Israel, when they took a census, when they numbered things, it was a public show of ownership. You are showing that you own those things and you are responsible for them. And so by David taking a census, he was actually doing something he wasn't allowed to do. There were censuses taken before, like God told Moses to take a census at one point in time, but there it was God telling Moses to do it. It's like God is saying, go do this with my things. It would be a very different scenario if, I have this computer, I'm recording this on this computer right now, and you guys know this usually sits on my desk. It'd be a very different scenario if I said, these two are different scenarios. If I said something like, hey Patrick, go to my desk, take my computer, and go search this, get this information for your project on something on wildebeests. Go look up wildebeests on Google and everything like that. And he sits down at my desk and starts typing. right? Okay, there's nothing wrong with that. But if all of a sudden we walk in the room after recess or whatever, and Patrick goes and walks to my desk, sits down and just starts typing things on my computer, I'd be like, what are you doing? You can't do that. You know, because it's my computer. I have the right to give permission. You cannot use it unless I give you permission, which I'm not going to give you. And so, very different scenario here. David decides just to, you know what? I'm going to number the people. I'm going to number them. And by that show, he's showing that he has ownership over them. He's saying, I am controlling the people. And so, and even Joab catches him in verse 3. Joab, who is not necessarily, Joab has his faults. We've seen Joab has a lot of different faults. He's very violent, but he's also not afraid to speak his mind when he sees something that's not right. And there's many times that he shows a little bit more wisdom than David. David sometimes has a little too much mercy. Well, not that there's too much mercy, but sometimes he doesn't, he kind of gives people a second chance too much, but sometimes he kind of gets caught up in things, and Joab is kind of just more of a realist. And Joab says to the king, now may the Lord your God add to the people 100 times more than there are. He's saying, David, hey man, I hope that God gives us 100 times what we have. I think it's great that that we have a lot of people, and I hope God adds 100 times more. And he goes, and may my eyes of the Lord King see it. He goes, and I hope you're around to see it. But why does my Lord the King desire this thing? Joab saying, hey, listen, David, I'm right with you. Because David, by saying the census, is like, you know what? I bet we got a lot of fighting. I bet we got a lot of soldiers here. Hey, go number the soldiers. I bet we got a big, big army. We could have a good-sized army. And Joab's like, hey, man, I'm right with you. I see how many people there are. There's a lot of people around. It looks like there's a lot of people in Israel. I pray that God gives us 100 times more that we have. But why do you want to do this? And you can kind of sense what Joab's getting and hinting at. It's kind of out of David's pride. David wants to get this number and be like, yeah, what kind of army do I have? I could probably go up against some pretty tough nations. It's pride that kind of blinds him temporarily to what he's doing. It said, nevertheless, the king's word prevailed against Joab and against the captains of the army. So it even shows right there, it says against Joab and the captains of the army, that it wasn't just Joab saying, David, don't do this. It was even the captains of the army. And think about how stubborn you have to be to have that many people telling you you're wrong. Think about that. Like, if you have someone in your life that speaks truth to you, that is a good thing. You need to always have somebody in your life who's willing to tell you that's a bad idea. Mia, you shouldn't do it. Or Cash, don't do it. Or Hector, cut it out. If you have a friend who has the ability to do that, cherish that relationship. Okay, if you always have a friend that just always says like, oh yeah, that's a great idea. Hey, what do you think? That's the best. Hey, what do you think of this? Oh, it's great. That it makes you feel nice, but it doesn't really do any good. You want somebody in your life who can speak truth to you, but there's a second part. You have to listen to them. Okay, there are times that people speak truth to you and or speak into your life and say, I don't think that's good. I mean, that happens to me all the time. I have like 3 or 4 guys that are older than me, that are my elders, that are wiser than me, who I will run things by and say, what do you think of this? What do you think of that? What do you think of this? But the final decision rests with me, and a lot of times I take their advice as I take their advice to be very important. When I ask them, I weigh what they say, and I weigh it very heavily. And oftentimes, what they say, I would say probably 90% of the time, I go with what they say because I trust them and trust their word, and a lot of times there's a lot of wisdom in it. But I don't always. I mean, I know with this current house that I have, there were some that said I shouldn't get it, but I felt like, God leading me to do this, and so I went for it. Or whatever other decisions. There sometimes I'm like, you know what? No, I'm going to weigh it. But the important thing is I weigh what they say, and I weigh all of the options, and weigh it all, and then I pray about it, and I ask God for discernment, and I go, you know what? All right, I'm going to move forward in this direction, the way that they said or the way that I don't say. But it's important to really take seriously and consider what people say. David is not doing that here. Joab is saying, don't do it. I don't know why you're doing this, David. Pride. But you shouldn't really do it. And the captain of the army is saying, David, this isn't really a good idea. If everyone around you is saying this isn't a great idea, doesn't mean it's not a good idea. But there's a good chance it's not a good idea, right? So we should listen to those around you. But It says therefore Joab and the captains of the army went out from the presence of the king to count the people of Israel. And this is something that took 10 months to do. It wasn't like, hey, go out there for an hour and do it. It was a long process. David should have kind of woken up to this throughout the 10 months. It was a pretty serious thing. When we read this, we don't have the full context of what it's like, what the idea was for Israel. So it's hard to kind of picture when there's a punishment later on. It doesn't seem like the punishment fits the crime, but David had a long time to repent of doing this and to apologize to God for it. And it was a much more serious thing in Israel than we can kind of understand. So anyway, skipping forward, they went through all the land. It said 9 months and 20 days. Almost took 10 months to do. I'm frozen. Sorry. Hopefully I come back soon. So it took 10 months to do. But chapter 24, verse 10. Let's see if I can get myself unfrozen here. I don't know why it's frozen. And anyway, I'm just going to keep going. Chapter 24, verse 10, it said, and David's heart condemned him after he had numbered the people. So David said to the Lord, I have sinned greatly in what I have done, but now I pray, O Lord, take away the iniquity of your servant, for I have done very foolishly. So David admits that he did wrong, and he said, please, God, forgive me. Verse 11, and when David arose in the morning, the word of the Lord came to the prophet Gad, David's seer. So this is a prophet. We've seen several different prophets like Nathan or whatever. And this guy comes to David and says, he speaks for God and tells God, I offer you, and God says to David, you're going to have a punishment, and you have the choice of this, this, and this. And I don't know if that's ever happened to you before, whether your parents have given you a choice of punishments, but you can kind of analyze those to death sometimes and be like, well, this, or I could do this, and if you really think on it, it can kind of be torturous. But so he has three things three punishments that he could have, and he could have 7 years of famine. Remember, famine is when there's no food in the land. He could have 3 months, so 7 years of famine, 3 months being pursued by their enemies, basically conquered by their enemies, and 3 days plague. What plague is like a really bad sickness that is deadly. So again, 7 years of no food, 3 months of being conquered by enemies, or 3 days of really, really bad plague just wiping through Israel. And so David makes this choice in verse 14. He said, I am in great distress. Please let us fall into the hand of the Lord, for his mercies are great, but do not let me fall into the hand of man. So let's analyze this. It's really kind of incredible what he does. He chooses the 3 days of plague, right? And this is pretty incredible how he does this. Part of the reason could be because he wants to keep things equal. Because think about it. If you choose 7 years of famine, 7 years of famine, who's going, and all three, by the way, people are going to die from all three. People die from famine, people die from fighting the enemies, and people die from plague. So he had people dying each time. But in the 7 years of famine, think about it. Who's most likely to survive? Is there somebody who's most likely to survive? Yes, the rich people who have tons and tons of stuff, including himself, who is royalty. If he has 7 years of famine, if anybody's going to survive, it's probably going to be him and the rest of the rich people. If he has 3 months of running away from the enemies, who's going to die most likely? The soldiers. David's older at this point. He's probably not going to die, and so it's going to be the soldiers, the young men, who are dying, and so he and all the women and children are going to be safe. But but in the third one, the 3 days of plague, people are going to die, but it could be anybody. That sickness could hit anybody in here, and it is doesn't respect riches, doesn't respect wealth or royalty. It hits everybody evenly. So that's one of the reasons why I chose it, was hit everybody evenly. Probably part of it was it could be there, done, and over with in 3 days, obviously. But another thing that's important is that he wants to make sure that he doesn't put himself into the hands of other nations. See, if it was a famine, they would try to get by with borrowing food from other nations. That's what they would try to get by with. So they would have to rely on other nations to give them food. If other nations didn't give them food, it would be worse. If other nations gave them food, it would be better. So it would basically be appealing to other nations. If he went with 3 months of running from their enemies, it would be the other nations that were killing them. And he would be hoping that the other nations were going to be merciful. In the third scenario, the 3 days of plague, it has nothing to do with other nations. The threat is from God himself. And he says that he'd rather instead of putting himself into the hands of other people, other nations, and relying on the other nations to be kind or whatever, or forgiving or merciful, he said he'd rather put his hands in the hand of God. And he says, if God wants to wipe me out or whatever, he can. And so he chooses the 3 days of plague, and God sent a plague upon Israel from morning till appointed time, and 70,000 people in verse 15 die, which is pretty crazy. And you might say, wow, that is so unfair. That's awful that could happen. And that's all for David's decision. Yes, it is. And here's the key. Remember, I've said this so many times this book. Your actions always affect those around you. Whatever you do, even though it's not fair, even though there's other people that have nothing to do with it, it will always affect the people around you, no matter what you do. If even though you don't want it to happen, it's going to affect other people. Your sin will always hurt others. And so David says in verse 17, let your hand, I pray, be against me and my father's house. He asked, please let this punishment be upon me. And that again shows what kind of leader David is. You can never picture Saul saying, let this punishment be upon me. Remember what he did back? He was defensive in 1 Samuel. He'd be like, well, it wasn't my fault. You see, the people and the Philistines and this and that. He would always be very defensive, and stuff wasn't his fault. But David begs God to put the punishment on him, but God says, nope, I have another plan. It's a plague going through Israel. And so the rest of chapter 24, David goes and builds an altar to God, and he sacrifices burnt offerings for his sin, and the plague eventually is withdrawn from Israel. And so that is the end of 2 Samuel. That we're going to go to the book of 1 Kings next. Intro, here I am, I'm back. Interestingly, the books of 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings were actually one set of books. Originally, they were 1 Kings, 2 Kings, or the books of the kings, and then they were separated into 4 books: 1 Kings, 2 Kings, 3 Kings, 4 Kings. So 1 Kings and 2 Kings used to be 3 Kings and 4 Kings, but then they changed the names to 1 Kings and 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings. But it's important to realize that those 4 books are basically chronological, and they just go from 1 Samuel to 2 Samuel to 1 Kings to 2 Kings all the way through. If you see Chronicles is basically those 4 books, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, summarized with little bits and pieces of information from that might be missing from those books, or kind of corroborated and doubled up. But basically, 1st and 2nd Chronicle is a summary of 1 Kings, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings. So we're going to be moving. If I were to summarize them, I'd say 1 Samuel is basically all about Saul's life. The end of the Judges is about Saul's life. 2 Samuel is all about David. We're going to see 1 Kings is all about Solomon. And